All right, welcome here. This is a recording for a couple of different purposes. This is part of the Living Resilience Deep Academy and also community of practice programs. And this is going to be really a capstone video for the meditation and implicit senses training here in the Deep Academy programs. And it's also going to be, this is also going to be an episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast to give folks who have not yet dipped their toe into the water with this Deep Academy stuff. I'd like to introduce you all to person who's really been around past number of years with, from Safe Circle for a while, and you've been a fairly, pretty much a regular, Tim, since a few months now, since the COVID time in the community of practice. And Tim Rempel is someone who brings a remarkable history and practice of Tibetan Buddhist practices. And I think he brings a remarkable gift of being able to relay some of that experience, some of that wisdom that he's gleaned over the years of being involved with that practice. And so we got to talking a while back. In fact, Tim was about the only human being that has come to visit during the whole COVID time down here in Southern Oregon and from his place over in Colorado. And it was just a very special visit. You know, it always is. I always learn so much, Tim, from your input. And, what I got to see is you are so able to adjust to the conversation, to whatever the level is. And we're going to be talking about a contemplative practice this conversation will be, I think, extremely useful for folks who are new to the idea of a contemplative practice. But I also feel like I predict that it will be useful for folks who have been around the block, who've been at this a while, maybe decades. And it doesn't really matter what your practice is, what lineage you're from. Mine are very different from Tim's. And what I find is time after time, there are these overlaps, areas of overlap, in addition to the differences. So I hope you will find, no matter what your level of practice and how long you've been at it, that you will find great value in this conversation. This is meant to be an overview of not only the different types of levels of engagement with contemplative practice, and I'll bring the stuff that I can chime in with for my lineage, and Tim his. But we're also going to be finishing up this conversation with really exploring, and heck, we may just thread it through the entire talk today, that I believe it's both of our experience, and perhaps it's yours as well, that this world is very, very different than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 25 years ago, even 1,000 years ago, in terms of contemplative practice. sure, there are essential core components, cornerstone pieces in any lineage that are as important now as they have ever been. So we're going to be talking about some of those. But just the ambient anxiety level, the ambient, I like to call it the heat is going up, but literally, obviously, in the climate change conversation. But globally, the anxiety level, the stress level, both collectively and individually, is so much higher than certainly I've ever seen in my life. And the prediction seems to be that it's not going to get any easier anytime soon. So that'll again probably be threaded through this whole talk. So Tim, I you've heard what I've said, and I would appreciate it if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself a little bit, letting people know about your history with contemplative practice, and perhaps you could mention a little bit about how the condition of the world is showing up for you. What are you seeing? What are you feeling? What are you noticing? And in your own contemplative practice community and in your own life. And again, thanks for taking time to have this conversation. I just know it's going to be valuable for me and hopefully for others as well. So, Tim Rempel,
Oh,
howdy.
good morning. Thank you for the intro, Dean. Yeah,
Yeah.
kind words. Yeah, my name's Tim. Have been involved with formal Buddhist practice for a couple decades now. Right at 20, 25 years, something like that. Actually got started in that world way back when in college in transcendental meditation, which for folks my age is not an uncommon place to start. And we can, over the course of things, we can talk a little bit about how that fits into the overall picture of things. One of the things Dean and I talked about was just how when you use the word meditation, it's so broad. And because it comes from, various traditions, spiritual traditions, sort of traditional ones, Buddhism being one, of course, but certainly not the only one. And there's kind of the boundary of what's one way to say is what's not meditation, but there is kind of a boundary in a way, in the sense that, yeah, like you say, Dean, it's contemplative, is certainly one kind of that, and in some traditions, I think of kind of out of the Abrahamic traditions, um, prayer and contemplation and that sort of thing is certainly one form of contemplation. From there, you can kind of, to put it one way, that you're still inside thoughts, if you will. You're still thinking about things. You're typically not talking, because, and that's one fundamental model. I can bring up a bunch of them from Buddhism, but one of the ones that I think is really useful is body, speech, and mind. Very fundamental. Similar to the five bodies stuff that you talk about, Dean. In that kind of a paradigm, if you kind of look at it broadly, the body piece is like, if you're old enough, hippie yoga back in the day. Nowadays, the trendy thing, I have a very dear friend that teaches Bikram, and hot yoga is the hot thing of the day. Is somehow appropriate for hot times. I don't know. It's like maybe because we're just so frazzled, if we can just turn up the heat enough that we just kind of let it all go. And certainly there's that kind of work with body, their postures. You can get in the body stuff. Are you basically absolutely still moving in postures or fully moving? A couple of 3 points in a spectrum, and you can really have physical meditation in any of those three. The speech one, mention that because classic contemplative things out of the Abrahamic traditions, any of them, I think of as silent almost all the time. It's also solo. is another dimension of this that Dean and I have talked about, and one I find fascinating, that if you look at all these different practices, which of them are originated in a context where they're thought of as individual, and then how can those, evolve or be used in group context? How can we design group context like Stina's wider embraces thing that's a deliberately guided thing? That's another dimension of this. Is it guided or not guided? Because, for example, Bikram is, as I understand that structure of that thing, 90 minutes, the teacher is talking the whole time, telling you when to breathe, cue in positions. It's the same movement pattern every time. So it's very much guided. The wider embraces stuff is guided. Some things are not. And mind, I'll close on that one, because mind, I think of there's kind of two subdivisions there that are useful to distinguish. One of them is basically mental practices, and classic sitting meditation is that kind of a thing. The other major subdivision there is really heart practices, and that, like in the insight Buddhist world, I was mentioning to Dean when we were talking before we started the recording. On Mondays, I do a daily meditation practice with a group, and the person that does Mondays is a metta master. She is just masterful at heart practices of all forms, and metta is kind of the cornerstone beginner one of those. Then there's more advanced ones. I think that's maybe a good introduction to it too. The one thing that maybe is a little bit less familiar to people if they're not used to sitting meditation kind of tradition is that the point isn't to try and get rid of your thoughts, but the point is to try and build a different relationship with them so you're not trapped inside them, and kind of build a different relationship with your feelings so you're not trapped inside the anger or the anxiety. Because you were talking about the temperature of the day. I mean, for the collapse aware community, we realized the temperature literally has been going up for a very long time. But the anxiety level temperature with COVID just, rightly so, just skyrocketed, because we're not quite at 2 million people worldwide that have died yet as of this recording, as of today, the 21st of December, but close to that number. So, and that's and depending on where you are in the world, is a thing that can induce tremendous amounts of anxiety.
Right. So I'm curious if I could just pause you for a moment right there, because it's one thing to be able to point at that direct cause of and symptom of anxiety and how it has escalated, exponentially. So yes. And another thing we talked about in a preparatory conversation was we're in a time when we literally are immersed 24/7 now in a weaponized environment in which our attention, individually and collectively, is the coin of the realm. It is being hunted, and it is being captured. All of our behaviors online, all of our behaviors where we go, everything is tracked and commodified to then be turned into a way to manipulate our behaviors in such a way that someone can profit from them, or someone can control, like a government can control a narrative for a populace and elicit particular levels of complicit behavior or compliant behavior. It's a different kind of escalation than the one you were just talking about with COVID, which is, clearly that is like in our face. For those who are impacted in that way, we can feel ourselves being concerned at a level of, will I get sick, and will I transmit this to the next vulnerable person that I meet, and on the different ways. that what you were talking about can continue to inflame at larger and larger levels. I just wanted to include that even larger ambient backdrop that we're involved with. And I keep calling it the immersion. We're immersed in it. We literally don't know that we're in it anymore, kind of like the fish in water. We've just become so normalized to having our attention sucked out and our intent sucked out, meaning our essential agency to have any other alternative. And so that's why I'm excited to have this conversation. That's why I'm excited to have this, not just meditation, but this implicit senses training included in this contemplative practice work, because it's the only place that I've found in my lineage to look within my own experience and find where that agency lives. So it's pert near gone, or it's hidden away, or it's constantly suppressed. So where would I go to reinvigorate it? Where would I go to reclaim it? And I keep pointing to the center of my body, and that's this whole implicit senses training, and that's a different conversation, but I just want to feather it in that they fit, and then kind of loop it back so that you can keep going wherever you'd like to go in terms of bridging from one of the longest, most rich lineages of contemplative practice, which is Buddhist practice, in the number of branches that there are. This is a rich and long-standing tradition now, long time around the world. Is there anything you'd like to say about how that any variant of the Buddhist traditions, how's it going when you look at how those traditions stand up in this environment, in this weaponized environment for our attention and intent?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, if anything, sometimes it's the those kind of practices give you some basis for not getting just utterly swallowed into what you're talking about, Dean. Because it's common experience everybody has nowadays of seeing people walking around with their faces glued to the device, and you see somebody walking the dog, and the dog's on the leash and their face is glued to the device. I've seen people on ski slopes that just couldn't put the bloody thing into the pocket long enough to actually ski. But you know how that is? It's like, buddy, be careful, don't run into the trees. We're so absorbed by that, and it's become, how it is in the last, like you were saying, 5-10 years. If you're old enough, it went from the age, kind of historically, of no TV to TVs, and that being very pervasive. And then now to the age of screens. They're portable, we're on them all the time. And the other thing is the web evolved. It became not so much a you go search, but it pushes towards you, it filters you, it targets you, it commodifies you. It's lethal, almost lethal, you know what I mean, with just, oh. And then you think about the future and all the artificial intelligence stuff, and it's just terrifying. It's beyond terrifying. To have a refuge, if you will, from all that, to have somewhere where you can put the device down, you can try and kind of let yourself settle. I mean, that's one thing nowadays, if you think about the state they want you in, is constant spin, constant churn, constant assimilation, and you're the exact opposite of calm abiding, if you will, especially in a mental sense or a heart sense. And the other thing about that is I talked about the body, speech, and mind earlier as if they were separate, but as you point out quite rightly, they're an integrated system. So if something's going on in one piece, it affects the other. And, so, and that's where it can be helpful to have a couple of three different practices across that spectrum that you can do. Because, for example, I think the heart work, and it's really fascinating too, if you get into the science of this stuff, that if you put somebody in a MRI machine and look at what's going on in their head and all that kind of stuff, the really heavy duty stuff nowadays, it's wild. If they're doing transcendental meditation and stuff way back when, you do that technique has one characteristic, very, very clear signature. If you do calm abiding practice, very different signature, very clear signature. If you do heart work, it has a third clear signature that's not like the other two. And so it really is complementary. And that's, part of the ancient wisdom kind of knew that you have your heart and you have your head, so to say. And, because they're just so intimately linked. And I think that's a thing of, at the head level, trying to kind of fend it off a little bit, or certainly maintain my ability to just kind of settle a bit, which in order to have it happen, I've got to turn off, how it is. If you're plugged into the news cycle continuously, especially the last 4 years, right, the skin has been just hyperbolic, yeah. It's just insane. Thankfully, it takes the weekends off because it golfs. You know what I mean? Otherwise, we would have been subjected to it 7 days a week, which would have been worse.
So I at the risk of being a little confusing for the especially for the new practitioner who might be watching this video, I want to speak from a different lineage. So I have a couple of years under my belt of very basic sitting practice down in Santa Cruz area, years and years ago with Lama Sogyal, who I found to be just a hoot. he was something. He was a real character, and I learned a bit and I experienced a bit, and I consider myself a rank beginner in any kind of Buddhist methodologies or understanding, but I do have that bit of history to call on. But I want to speak about other kinds of meditation from my lineage or my experience over years and years to add to what you were just talking about. There are a number of kinds of meditation that are quite dynamic. Literally, they called it dynamic meditation from the folks who followed Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, or Osho. And Osho was incredibly prolific writer, created a whole multiversity in east of Bombay in India. Also put together a community up here in Central Oregon, near where I live. And folks can watch the Netflix special. I think it's called Wild Country. And it has its own brand of shadow and its own brand of just outrageousness. But one thing he was able to do was to create a bridge between what could be considered some kinds of Indian, perhaps Hindu, and other methodologies from the Indian subcontinent that he adapted to the Western mindset, and he was really good at it. And so he had a whole raft of dynamic meditations that involved a very specific cadence through a number of segments of different kinds of music for 10 minutes of this, 10 minutes of that, 10 minutes of quiet, 10 minutes of then swaying and so on. Each one a slightly different pattern of different behaviors, different breathing, different motion. And I found them quite extraordinary. And he also trained a lot of therapists for the therapy that could go along with this kind of dynamic meditation program. And of course, they did their own brand of sitting and so on. I also was exposed for quite some time to earth-based meditation and also plant medicine involved contemplative work. And very, very different than anything I understand to be going on with Buddhist practices. So I just wanted to add those in because what I think what we're if we're talking to someone who's relatively new to the idea of having a contemplative practice, there are a couple things we talked about, you and I, a week ago when we were looking at what are we going to talk about today. One of them was, there's a time for shopping when someone's new and they're just hearing about, "Oh, what is this contemplative stuff, or what is this meditation stuff?" And we all got to get our toe in the water somehow, and you got to figure it out. You got to figure out what is right for your system, and what do you have access to that could actually have some continuity for you, and so on. And that leads me to the other basic point is, so first, allow yourself a time of being a beginner and being a shopper to find out what will work for you. And then something we both talked about last week was, above all, if you get onto this path, find something that you can have a regular practice with. So let me just stop there. I know I covered a lot of ground. I'm curious if those two basics, allowing yourself to be a beginner when you're a beginner,
Oh yeah.
and then also this idea of what seems to impress on the system in a good way is to have a very regular practice. So let me stop there and see, does that spark you to say anything?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I think you're right on both of those counts. Because there's so many alternatives. At first, you do have to do a kind of a little bit of kind of trying on the clothes and see if they sort of fit, see if it resonates with you. Because different people, people are so different, and different people are going to resonate with different things. And I like what you were saying too about the dynamic meditation, because that's another thing that if that kind of an integrated practice works well for you, then go with it. It's kind of good to look around enough to kind of get a sense of and try things a little bit, like you say, stick your toe in the water a bit and get a sense of what might work for you. But then once you kind of get a sense of that, go with that. And like you say, the second part is absolutely important too, because each one of those things, it's um, to put it one way, it's amazing that even if you could do, just to name a relatively small number, 15 minutes, say, a day, and you might have to work up to that starting from even 5 minutes. But even if you get to the point of, after a few weeks, couple weeks, something like that, that you can do some practice for 15 minutes, even that much of a distinction out of the rest of your day is so therapeutic, because it's kind of like sleep in a way, that you've got to sleep pretty much every day in order to maintain psychological function and whatnot, and it can be amazing, even a little bit of practice on a regular basis can really because it's such a, again, I'll use the word refuge, and that word's used in the Buddhist context in a bunch of ways, but refuge in the sense of an oasis, if you will, from all the madness, that if nothing more, what I do is I end up creating in my own mind and my own heart and my own body an oasis that I can retreat to from all the madness. And I get over time comfortable with that and familiar with that. And then over time too, and you know how with a lot of these practices, once you learn them, you can do them in a variety of settings. You can learn to do them pretty much on demand. You can learn to, it's the whole thing about regulate self-regulation and co-regulation and all of that, that they're skills, I guess, is what I'm trying to say in summary. And I think that's an absolutely essential thing, because when I grew up, I was a musician when I was a kid. And if you want to learn to play the piano or the trumpet or whatever the devil it is, you got to have somebody teach you, because you probably won't figure it out all by yourself unless you're really exceptional. And for sure, you got to practice it. Because if you don't practice in between lessons, you're not going to get any better. And, You know, it is as a kid, sometimes you have the experience of you come to the teacher and you didn't do any practice. And they say, you know, it's going to be a very short lesson today. You need to go work on it. What I told you last week, then come back. And your parents are kind of bummed because it's like they're, you know, but you know, that's why I love, because I really love the music analogy, because it really does kind of fit that way that, by golly, if you keep practicing piano and have a good teacher, eventually you'll be playing some of that crazy Russian stuff that's just a billion notes on a single page. You know, but it's also progressive. You've got to work through it in levels. And I think the other thing too, it's like you kind of alluded to, and I think my teacher's big on, is like, Lord knows in this culture, we are so damned hard on ourselves and so judgmental and so perfectionist that, you know, it's like when it comes to contemplative stuff and meditation and all that, if you can kind of just be a little bit easy on yourself, a little easier, it actually is tremendously beneficial because it opens up possibilities. Otherwise, if all you're doing is in your head applying what one of my buddies, David Lloyd, calls the lack project mentality to it, you know, that I'm seeking out that which I lack and I'm going to go acquire it. If you're applying that kind of mentality to this, it's not going to go so well. Because it's not, amongst other things, with that mindset, you never get to the inside of it. You're always on the outside of it. And you're probably going to stop doing it as soon as you think you've acquired it. And that's the crazy thing about being awake, is it's not like a light switch. It's not a one-time thing. It's in every moment kind of thing.
Yeah.
The beauty of that is, you know, I could have been scared as heck a few moments back. I could be angry this moment, you know, a few moments from now, I can be in a totally different state. And once I learned to drive that a little bit more, that's also kind of an armor, or, you know, almost like, I've heard you mention, you know, it's almost like a martial arts training. That, you know what I'm saying, I kind of keep the insanity at bay, because no, I'm not, you know, I'm not going to let that level of it into my mind. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you bringing that up about the, you know, being on the mat, the notion of contemplative practice being something akin to a martial art. I think that is a good kind of dot to connect with what we were just talking about a couple of minutes ago about the weaponized, a constant attack on our attention and our agency, or our center. And there's no other concept I've heard more about and experienced more coaching about on the mat than center. Everything comes from the center. And I'm saying this kind of pointedly because I look forward to hearing what your response is from your own experience and your own lineage. I'd like to just mention that, you know, for folks who don't know about this body of work, this Living Resilience Deep Academy, place where people can come together and really expand their capacity to be present in the face of larger and larger stressors. In other words, they can reclaim a center. You know, one of my biggest assertions in my own life and experience and in this work is that we've lost our center. In order to participate in the business as usual frenzy, you know, this fossil fuel driven extravaganza that we all call normal, that we all have to shut down to some degree or another, but no one wants to say the words, you know, but we've got to get degrowth going on. It is what it costs to get in the door, what it costs to be able to reap benefits from the business as usual world, is we had to disconnect from deeper self, disconnect from each other, disconnect from earth, and disconnect from soul. You know, that's kind of my buzz phrase for what the costs are for this, what got us into this predicament, this disconnection. There are a number of different lineages, number of different bodies of work that I've gathering for my own practices, and I'm also gathering to offer to other people like a menu they can choose when they're putting together their own practices of reconnection, which I'm considering this whole contemplative practices conversation got to be central. More likely than not, people are going to have a contemplative practice. And so what I wanted to really just anchor for perhaps the rest of this conversation is the notion that what we're talking about is reclaiming our center. If you can go along with this assertion that I'm saying of what got us into this predicament is we've disconnected, and one of the biggest costs of that disconnection is we lost our center. We forfeited our center. So that I might take on a contemplative practice as one of a number of practices to reclaim the many things that I've lost in those disconnections. And for many people, the first one that we need to go for is reclaiming and remembering that we once had a center. And the vast majority of people don't have a center. If we're on social media and we find ourselves just polarized and part of the public conversation, which is just attack and explode and being dysregulated, hour after hour, all day long, and so on. These are really common symptoms of being without a center. So I wanted to say all that to bring in the word center, the whole notion, how it fits with what you were mentioning about the contemplative practice can be seen as a martial arts practice, like on the mat, having that center and so on. I'm wondering if what I've just been saying sparks you to say anything.
It does. And I think a piece that, like the dysregulation idea, it's kind of like dysfunctional, even kind of even more in a way, because it's really, to riff on the center thing. I mean, there's like levels of that. I mean, a couple of three immediately come to mind. And it's back to the body, speech, and mind stuff in a way. One of them is if what's going on in your mind, the weather, so to say, in your mind is completely driven by them, and the thoughts are being completely injected by them, you've lost control. You're just, kind of a fishbowl that they're stuffing stuff into. And you don't have any center because you're just on the receiving end. And in order to get back to a state where you could claim agency over your own thoughts, even, it is, Dean. I mean, in the extreme example of this, it's that extreme that people have lost agency over their own minds, almost. Kurt Elling has a great song about the Rio Grande River and him being just kind of physically the way he is. There's a line in there where he talks about America has lost its mind. And he grew up in the Lutheran world and is from Chicago and can just be, it's just insanely intense. But I think he's pointing at the right thing because, there's that level. Similarly, there's the heart level of they're determining your feelings. They're pumping that in. Oh, you're supposed to feel good about this, or you're supposed to feel bad about that. And again, you've lost all your agency. It's just, it's just insanity. And then, and at the body level too, because they're, from a Buddhist point of view, the fundamental confusion is you think of yourself like, for example, your physical body, me sitting here, is separate from the rest of us. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. I'm from the earth. I'm on the earth. I'm never going to be anything other than that. And I might think of myself as separate, but that's kind of as I've heard it put, an optical illusion of consciousness. It looks like that to me. It looks like that to everybody. But I think it was Joseph Campbell or one of those guys, maybe Alan Watts. that I think it was Campbell, there's this thing about this circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. So that everybody looks like you're the center. That's how it looks for everybody. But once you realize everybody looks like that, and by the way, the trees see the same thing, and so do the chipmunks. You know what I'm saying? And we're part of the natural world. And look at the mess we've gotten our butts into because we completely lost track of that. That's where I loved your thing about, you know, the 4 points. And yeah, we're so disconnected from Earth. We act like we're from another planet or I don't know what. It's just, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's madness. It's absolute madness.
Yeah. Well, I got another reminder from last week when we were looking ahead to this conversation, and I was really captured by something that you talked a little bit about, and it's definitely my experience as well, but I think we have slightly different pitfalls that we might be aware of from our different lineages and our different practices, you know, like mine from a shamanic or energetic or plant medicine lineages probably are going to be a little bit different than the Buddhist traditions. I don't know. We'll find out. But I'm curious because again, just the blend of for some of these lineages, thousands of years of practices being handed down and being worked. There's some wisdom to be conveyed, and there's some pitfalls that serious practitioners have bumped into, and it's kind of like clockwork for one who's a master and been around a long time. They can see the newcomer coming, and they can see them heading right toward any number of pitfalls. And then on top of that, we have what we're talking about today, which is this weaponized environment in which the intensity and the rapidity, the velocity of this world, and how much of a direct and literally a violent attack on our center and a violent attack on our attention. There are many pitfalls that weren't there 1,000 years ago, that weren't even there 20 years ago at this level and this intensity. So I'm wondering if we could shift gears to saying whatever you might be sparked to say about pitfalls from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things I guess come to mind. One of them mentioned earlier, and definitely the thing about being harder on ourselves, is one. Another one is this in the Tibetan world around Boulder. One of the guys that started Naropa University, Choyung Trungpao, way back in the 70s, wrote a book in 73 called Spiritual Materialism. It's a fairly technical book. It's not exactly a beginner book, but boy, did he nail it, that we bring the materialism mentality to everything, including anything remotely spiritual, contemplative, anything like that. And that's just such a barrier right there, because if what you end up doing is shopping in the form of, I look at the red pair of shoes and I go, oh, I don't like them. I want blue ones instead. And then I look at the blue pair of shoes and go, oh, I don't like them. They don't fit right. And I just keep kind of acquiring and discarding. If I'm stuck in that kind of a shopping loop, so to say, boy, I'm really never going to get anywhere. You know, in the spiritual realm or a whole lot of other places for that matter. But anyway, you know, that I think it's good. It's, you know, you don't want to keep shopping in that sense. At some point, you got to put on the pair of shoes and it's back to the practice thing. So that's definitely one of them. The other thing that you alluded to earlier is it's like, if you really look at why are you doing this to begin with, and that one, that keeps morphing over the years. I mean, at first it can be, I want a little relief from the insanity, and that's a damn valid reason to start. even if it's just a little relief, like I was mentioning earlier, when I start, maybe it's just 5 minutes a day and then I'll work up. That it really depends on what you're after. And that's something that's useful to kind of reflect on. Sometimes, it's stress reduction, sort of relief from suffering in some sense, I guess. But I think it is good to look at why you're doing this and be realistic about it, because like one of the biggest pitfalls again is that it's the light switch mentality. It's the we do it once and we're done mentality. It's the I acquire it and I got it mentality. And the problem is that just doesn't fit reality, because I can be awake in 1 minute or 1 day, but then there's the following Wednesday the next week. Well, what's the story with that day? And so forth. So it's really, what I'm saying? It's not, and that's one thing, if you realize that ultimately the point of it is just to, certainly some kind of those practices, is just to kind of learn to more and more wake up moment to moment, and you just work on this moment to moment. And in that sense, there's really nowhere to go, in a sense. There's nothing to accomplish. What you're accomplishing is actually being alive and being human. Mm-hmm. Instead of being spun. Because especially, like you so eloquently pointed out, Dean, nowadays it is weaponized. In other ways, you just on the end of the spear.
I don't know if I'm out of line by wanting to just add a tiny bit to what you were just saying, because I totally get it about there is no agenda, which is part of the head exploding for many people just starting out with a contemplative practice, is like, what? No agenda? It's like, that's all there is in life, is my life, my plan, my agenda, my to-do list, and so on. To kind of bridge it back to what I was just saying about, my kind of offhanded way of describing what the costs of these areas of disconnection are that got us into this predicament, that really the core practice for us all, if you're aligned enough to say, yeah, okay, we're disconnected, it seems to me that the core practice for us all is to reconnect with the web of life. And your emphases might be different than mine. You might be reconnecting with earth and intimate relationship, and I might be reconnecting with soul. We're talking about potential pitfalls. I don't know how to express the scale of what you were just talking about, of this releasing outcome or releasing agenda. I mean, just, it's massive. It's massive when I look at what we're immersed in all the time in the business as usual world. Is, we're all on the rat race, on the hamster wheel, and it is all about the agenda. It's all about the outcomes. And ironically, it's also having the vast majority of us have lost our center. So we're moving faster and faster on the hamster wheel and having no center, having no home within to return to a state of being that we can call like an optimal state that we can breathe back to regulate. You're talking about self-regulation and co-regulation. There's a whole part of the introductory series to this living resilience stuff, this Deep Academy. We got a whole series on resilience, and one of the biggest skills at the center of that is self-regulation and co-regulation, which means being able to, at will, bring ourselves back, return ourselves to center, return ourselves to a preferred state of being, rather than being centerless, basically adrift and being bashed about. I don't know quite how to say this pitfall that I'm trying to speak about, but it's right in this vicinity. And it's, my experience of having many, many of what I call impossible conversations with people. That's the name of my book from 2017. And it really talks about, because we have lost our center, because we have got all these disconnections in every direction, we aren't going to have the real impossible conversation, which is, this paradigm must change. This fossil fuel driven extravaganza that we call normal, especially in the privileged countries, we have to severely downscale the consumption and so on. This next pitfall that I want to speak about is elusive as heck, because everybody thinks they got it going on. Everybody's had a life strategy that has gotten them to this point. And right now we have words like life hacks and, the 8 ways that rich people get richer, and the 4 ways that happy people get happier, and on and on. And we're so full. And my experience is like that long-standing kind of spiritual story of the teacher pouring tea for the student, and pours and pours until their cup is overflowing, and the student's saying, "Wait, you're flowing, you're putting too much into the cup. You can't take anymore." And of course, the punchline of the story is, "Well, this is how you've come to me. You're full, and there's no room for the enlightenment you seek in this fullness." And so again, I'm sorry to drag this out, but what I'm after is a way to articulate kind of the words that come to mind are, "No, I got this. I got this. Yeah, no, hey, it's totally fine. I got this. This whole extinction thing, no, we're fine. We're good." Or, this whole, no healthcare for a country that is in full-blown pandemic mode, and half the country is completely obliterated economically, financially. No, we got this. We got it. It's fine. I don't I don't need any practice. I don't need any reconnection with center. We got this. We just need to vote for better people, or we just need to do this or that thing that we've always been doing. We just need to do it, tweak it just a little bit and do it better. So I know that was long-winded, and I know it never really got it's kind of pearl of clarity, but I hope it is communicating. And I'm wondering if it sparks you to say anything from what you've seen.
Yeah, boy, I think I know what you're pointing at. Yeah, and it's not exactly easy. I mean, to articulate. I think one of the things we've become disconnected from is an actual, like, valid source of truth, to put it one way. It might sound kind of weird, but let me unpack that slightly. An awful lot of what goes on nowadays is because of the weaponization and all the stuff coming at us. What it tries to do, kind of irrespective of like political things or government or commercial, business stuff, because it's all sort of the same. It's trying to always come at us and tell us what we're supposed to believe, mm-hmm. in a way, or find true or hold to be true, that kind of thing. And if we do that, then that's always outside of us. And what we really need to do is reconnect with the one inside of us.
Yes.
Our actual system, our actual heart. Trust our own goodness. Trust that in spite of the fact that I may think crazy things, I'm not actually really exactly crazy. I just have all this junk going around in my head. But, maybe some of them kind of fish it out and throw that thought away and say, yeah, I don't believe that. And do that with the next, and get back to a sense of agency and a sense of finding truth inside ourselves, and whatever contemplative or meditation practice you have to do, or physical activity, if it's like, if you find Zen, so to say, in bicycle stuff or mountain bike things, or whatever it happens to be, wherever it is for you, recognize that for you truth is there, and ultimately it's inside you, and that's what we need to get back to, and desperately need to get back to, in a way, because otherwise we are so manipulated. It's insane.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that the thing, I guess, the pitfalls, to say it one way, the pitfall is, if you don't trust the practice, if you don't do the practice, and maybe most of all, if you don't trust yourself, because we've been taught not to.
Yeah.
And we need to decolonize, detrain, come to realize that, yeah, sometimes I'm very angry, but other times I'm very compassionate, and other times I'm very sad. And, it's like a lot of things that, because that's one thing I liked earlier you mentioned about dynamics, because if you think about it, like I mentioned earlier, moment to moment to moment to moment, the fundamental substrate of reality this way, is that time keeps flowing inexorably. And the more you kind of lined up with, that's how it is, so I don't expect it to be static. I'm willing to let it move, willing to let the energy move through me, willing to trust myself, willing to do the practice, willing to see where that goes. The more dynamic you are that way, because I think it's back to the martial arts thing, and I'm sure you love this, but it's like, if you stand in some weird rigid posture on a martial arts mat, anybody who's any good at a number of different disciplines can come up and put you on the ground like that. If you're, and it's that way. It's like, it's crazy. I'm a big skier. And if you do mogul skiing, you ultimately have to be like the water flowing downhill between the moguls. The more you can be like that and be the dynamic of it and get out of your own way, learn to trust yourself, and you'll get better and better at it. And it's really pretty cool. And it's, it's interesting too, because in that world, it's like the shift that happens in your mind, instead of it being so frantic, it becomes very calm. It's like almost to the point of effortless. And maybe that's the ultimate pitfall, in a way, is to think that you have to accomplish something. You have to be hard on yourself to make that happen. And, you have to be rigid. Yeah.
Right.
If anything, exactly the opposite of that, because that's, in a way, the whole thing about, like, the Tibetans talk about taming and training the horse. First, you got to tame it, put it on the end of the rope, and, the American Indian thing, round and round and round in circles, like they show in the kid flicks. And then eventually you can train the thing. And, our minds are basically the same thing. And that's why, like, in the whole Buddhist world, that sitting meditation is one of the cornerstones, because it's the major mechanism for taming. From there, then we can get on to training and more advanced things and more powerful things that, presumably will make the process on the path go a little faster. But, it's kind of wild, that cornerstone, you never leave. It just kind of keeps morphing in form. But it's really cool at the ultimate level that I don't practice. I'm not nowhere near this. I've heard that in the final analysis, like with sky yoga, as I've heard it called, you sit there and you kind of do nothing. It's kind of crazy, because if you can master doing nothing just right, there's nothing to do and there's nowhere to go, and it turns out it's all really good. And you can just sit there in that state, and it's actually, pretty blissful. And then, how it is. You know, the real masters can sit there and practice for a couple, 3 hours, and then they got to get up and pee. So, you know, it's all good. It's, you know, it's, and I think that sense of it too, that's one thing that, you know, I hope people is if they come to this and begin to practice even a little bit, get a sense of that, that innate goodness, that innate dignity, that kind of a recognizing that, even if you just get a little glimpse, and then a few days later, you get a little tiny glimpse for just a sec. Gorgeous, gorgeous.
Yeah.
Glimpses will come more frequently. They'll get bigger. It's kind of like playing more advanced piano stuff. You'll get there.
Yeah. Well, Tim, I can feel the envelope of our time is finishing up, and I really appreciate being able to do this with you to offer kind of a primer, if you will, for people to be able to come in, and whether they have a lot of experience or not, to be able to get a sense of what it is we're talking about when we're, you know, kind of adjusting the bells and whistles on this body of work. And it just amazes me how much consistency there is, how much overlap or resonance there is between different bodies of work. You're obviously speaking from the Buddhist traditions, and I've got my own pieces that I've been representing today. And it reminds me of a couple of other of the bodies of work that I've been putting into this imaginary toolkit that I pull from for practices, and also offer up to others who are practicing in this deep academy program. Is you know, I'm thinking of the well systems women, primarily women in that lineage, and they would have been a perfect fit in these, especially this last 10 minutes. That's where they live. That's what their lineage goes right there, and especially to have it be as effortless as possible, to be deeply internally referent and empowered in that way. So, and there are other bodies of work that we could bring up, but I mostly just wanted to mention the uncanny overlap from these some relatively brand new lineages that have come up in the past 20 years, right next to one that's been around for 2,500 years.
Oh yeah.
It is mind-blowing. And so I just really want to thank you again for being willing to have this conversation, share what you have to share from your extensive history, and also what you're seeing these days. That was especially important for you to bring what you're seeing, and how your lineage can still, you know, have an important place in the incredible weaponized environment that we keep talking about.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, I just really appreciate your time, and look forward to more conversations in the future about the next layer and the next layer of what it's like to try and put together a practice that allows me to be more and more present in the face of God knows what scale of stressors coming down the pike.
Yeah, and that's where I love it that you hit on the cornerstone too, the whole thing of letting go of outcome, because that is just such a huge deal, you know, like for anybody in any kind of activist work, you know, climate stuff, social justice, you know, pick a realm, that, you know, how it is for activists and people, and just in general, with people who are class aware, that the more you cling to outcome, or the more you abide in thoughts of the future that really aren't noble, and the Zen guys say, look, quit doing that, because very far out in the future, we don't know. You can't know in detail. We're not going to know till you get there. And if you spend all your todays worrying about tomorrow, you throw all them away. You don't want to do that. You just don't want to do that. Let go of the outcome, see how it goes today. And together we'll all get through this, you know how it is, as best we can. And who knows what
Yeah.
what the future holds. Could be terrible, you know what I mean? Because it's just, we think we can imagine it, and when we're really honest, we kind of realize, maybe I can't.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I look forward to walking that path with you, brother. Always a
Yeah.
pleasure.
No, it always is. It's always good talking to you, Dean.
All righty.